Ba-da-dum, ba-da-da-dum. Hello everyone, and well, it's a comment response video. And what can I say with a comment response video? Well, this is the comment response video to the videos out for 1941 and 42. And you sort of knew this was coming. Over the next hour, I'm going to go through some of the questions, some of the comments, and try and answer some of them to the best of my ability. There were a lot of very interesting comments, and I have to say I've got them all listed up here on this screen. So I've had to use the big screen for them. I still haven't got, of course, procured the necessary tower unit to run both big screens and do everything on tower. So this is on the laptop, and the tower won't be set up till probably the second half of September, all funding and everything going correctly. Thank you for everyone's support. I will add that in now. I will also add this little note. As it's a comment response video, and I'm going to be getting into the comments. I can add this at the beginning. There is definitely a link between the YouTube algorithm and how many people like, how many people share, and how many people comment on a video, and how much it gets circulated. And it's quite disturbing to an extent how much that can affect things. It's also quite interesting as you got the bands of subscribers, and the more and more people you have subscribing, the more that helps in terms of getting the circulation out there wider. And as you know, I'm in this for the joy of telling people about naval history. The fact that it also now funds most of my research, the vast majority of my research funding, is down to your support on YouTube with just watching the videos and seeing the adverts, let alone the super chats, the super thanks, the memberships, the Patreon, the PayPal, all the other stuff. Frankly, all of that makes my research possible. So thank you. And it's just amazing. And I said, it's going to be new computer soon, which will hopefully improve things. Because I do think this poor laptop is currently starting to go, it's too much, it's too much, it's too much. She's been doing a good job. She's done it for near on 2 years now. And I think me trying to improve things and push things a little bit further has made it just that tad more difficult. Right. 9681 brought up a very interesting question. A good example is going to be Vice Admiral Hood. When he Holland, when he goes down with Hood, nobody replaced him as commander of the battlecruiser squadron. And as Alistair Shaw then commented, example, Holland and Care almost bigger losses than their ship. Yes, this is the disturbing thing which people forget in war. It's easier to replace ships than it is experienced personnel. Now, we'd normally be talking about senior officers at this point, but also senior NCOs. The big losses with Courageous and Glorious were not their air crews. You can train air crews fairly well. Losing a few of them is problematic, but you can make that up. Losing their senior officers, it's an issue, but it's survivable. Losing all those maintainers, all those chiefs, all those NCOs who run the maintenance of your carrier air group is frankly devastating. The Royal Navy loses 2 full carrier loads of its pre-war experienced maintainers and fitters. Just think about that. I've talked in the past about the loss of the damage control officers and the experience of running damage control, being trained for years in running damage control on a carrier, and how it's different from running on a battleship, and how that has a knock-on impact on Ark Royal and various other ships. Well, you've also lost all the fitters, all the maintainers, all those people who would have formed the nucleuses of the next air groups, of next carriers, which they came through. When we talk about the U-boats, we talk about how every U-boat lost in the early part of World War II has a massive impact for the German Navy, for the Kriegsmarine, as it goes on. Because Where are they going to get the experienced trainers from? Where are they going to get the people to train the next generation U-boatmen from if they've lost them? It's the same with the aircraft carriers. It's the same with the carrier air groups. These are people which matter. And if you lose them early on, they're a big loss. So, yes, you have to figure out a way to try and keep your people alive. There are many, many write-ups about the Royal Navy in World War II. There are some I agree with, some I completely disagree with. But losing those personnel is something which I consistently see the vast majority of books overlooking. There are some good ones which pick it up. But there are many books which treat the loss of the ship as the big thing. No. Yes, it might take a while for the Royal Navy to build a ship, but it's far easier for them to rebuild a ship than magically give someone 30 years of experience in the service. You can do one, you can't do the other. The other takes 30 years, whether you like it or not. So every senior NCO, every NCO, every mid-ranking senior officer you lose has an impact on your service. It has an impact on any Navy. Whatever they are, it has an impact on their service. Now, then we had an interesting question from Quizmaster China. If Force Z had had its carrier with him, then 3 ships would have been sunk. I honestly asked myself whether the carrier was purposely held back for that reason. Now, that comes up, and his whole point comes up because he thought that there would have been fighters there, that the attack group would have had fighters with them. They didn't. They were land-based Bettys. So does it really matter what carrier you have out there? Any carrier is going to break up the attacking group. And I don't know if Prince of Wales survives, but if you have the fighter control the carrier provides, i.e., the coordination of land-based fighters, so the air group, the organic air group, provides initial air defense and will probably keep up for quite a while, but will also interlay with land-based fighters which could come up. That's going to make an impact on your operational capability. Does Prince of Wales still get hit? I don't know. But does Repulse get hit is a different matter. And if Repulse doesn't go down, and Prince of Wales only gets hit once, then the Royal Navy probably retains Admiral Phillips. Probably he ends up shifting his flag to the Repulse, or the carrier, whichever one it is. And that carrier and Repulse would end up forming the genesis, and when I say genesis, I mean the foundation for Abda Command. And all the cruisers and destroyers and everything would be grouped around them. Now, what impact does that have? I don't know. But I honestly think that the Japanese then have to send a larger force down because they want a guaranteed victory. Because the Japanese do understand if they lose people, they're not going to get any more from anywhere. Which is why when they deploy force, they tend to deploy overwhelming force. If you consider Hawaii has every single carrier available that they can send, they send. The Royal Navy in Taranto, well, A, they're using 1 carrier for diversion. Okay, so you can say they're using 2 carriers in operations. But they do have other carriers wandering around the world at this point. If they'd wanted to, they could have sent one of the other carriers from somewhere to focus in on it. But no, they'd gone with what they had available because of the distributed nature of their operations. But also because it's 1 carrier. It's a viable risk. If things really go south, there's going to be a lot of battleships to get them out. Theoretically. Now, Michael Cooch. Dispersing the French fleet. Could you disperse the Dunkirks to the Far East? A, it's well out of Germany's grips, and B, on the basis that a fast squadron of Dunkirks plus destroyers based there might act as a deterrent to Japanese groves at French colonies. Now, there's an interesting point, because the Shrike 616 then brings up the idea of, quite honestly, I see a scenario where a second Mezo Kabir could happen in Saigon. Probably force the RN to commit additional forces to the Far East. The impact on Abda Command could be interesting, as would impact on probably the Mediterranean. Now, interestingly enough, There is an interesting debate put forward by Andrew Cox and various things about what happens if the French fleet become potential Axis force. And that is an issue. But I also don't see the British performing a Mirza Kabir in the Far East, and let me explain why. You do Mirza Kabir where you do it, and that's fine. You do not have to take a carrier group and a battle group far away from the area of decision. But if they have to go over to the Far East, that's a big problem. Plus, the only way the French are really getting out to the Far East is with British support. In which case, British fuel. And then once they get to the Far East, the only way they're keeping those ships fueled is with the Dutch support. Dutch fuel. So, the only scenario where they get to the Far East is where they're under officers who are sympathetic to the Allies, and the Allies are going to keep an eye on them. And actually, the Far East could have been a fine place to stick them. Also, then produces an entirely different idea of what Force Z might have been bullied at one side. It's an interesting idea. Michael Coach, would Lord Gort be an option for a Far East command? Not really. He's army. Please let me explain why that is. The army is not going to take responsibility for the Far East Command. They do not want to take responsibility for Far East Command. They've got problems going up in North Africa. They're worried about the invasion of the UK. They are obsessed with the issues they've got. Those are the commands they want. Those are the commands they have. Those are the commands which are causing the most stress. There's a reason the Combined Forces Commander of the Army Air Force out in the Far East is an Air Force officer. And it's one of the ones which the Air Force is really... let's put it this way, not the first rank of officers who they really want for very critical operations. So, yeah, it's basically the only chance you're going to have of getting someone who has the realistic level of political acumen and status within the British command structure to be able to draw people together and command people and organize them is the Navy. The others aren't going to happen. So, yeah, that's not an option. It's just not really going to happen. But your other point of a combined Far East command screaming and shouting from aircraft carrier would be a good justification for early satellite fleet carrier program. There's a realistic possibility of that one. There's also a possibility that they just accelerate on with Unicorn and the smaller carriers as quickly as they can, and basically get everything in the water as quickly as they can do. Joshua Williams, Dr. Clarke, I love the information you provide. I just beg of you to better regulation on the volume of videos. Sometimes the variation of volume is enough to wake me up when I fall asleep. Well, speaking as an academic, I do naturally vary my voice to make students wake up in a class if they try and fall asleep. So that might be that coming through. But also, I am basically it's XSplit on the laptop, and I'm doing my best. I'm doing my best to try and work it up and trying to get it all together. Michael Cooch, if the US did forward base at Singapore, then they may have provided some capabilities, fighter squadrons, well-trained troops, US Marines, British historically weren't able to provide at the time. Could that make the subsequent Singapore campaign different? For example, 4C may have had some air cover. Not well. You see, the reason 4C doesn't have air cover is not because the air cover fighters aren't there. It's because of misunderstanding on the systems, i.e., there's no bomber support, and so there's no air support and air reconnaissance available. But there's still fighters available on call. The fighters are sitting in Singapore waiting to be called, but the signal that's come through to Phillips' command at sea was basically there's no on-call air, so there's no point calling for anyone if there's no on-call air. There are issues, but the US is not going to withdraw from the Philippines. So that's the problem. That's where the Americans are focusing their forces in the Philippines. G.D. Ham, overworking the British animals in 1912, Fred Jane wrote of the problem. Ever since the British Navy has existed, it has sucked its origins dry and then cast them aside. That probably is why it is the British Navy. To an extent. To an extent. Definitely to an extent. Joshua Williams, I find Alaska baffling. How is she so inferior to, say, USS Washington on her tonnage? In terms of armor and 5-inch 38s and torp protection, is 5 knots that much tonnage in machinery? I know it's exponential. Could a 31-ish knot Alaska have done more, given the weight savings of the 12s? Well, Andrew Cox starts off with a good reply. Just look at the difference between the South Dakotas and ours. The Iowas were a development of the South Dakotas to be fast carrier escorts and grew 10,000 tons just for the machinery. At that point, a lot of people asked, why are we paying 10,000 tons for 6 knots? So the 16-inch 45s were swapped for the 16-inch 50s from the 20 South Dakotas, which would go into a large amount, only for this to be too heavy, starting the string of muck-ups, which would end up with a new 16-inch 50 design in the current mounts, creating the hours we know and love. Freeman notes that the design studies estimated a 30-knot ship could have been done for 37,600 tons, a 33-knot ship on 39,300 tons, but as the 33-knot design grew to 45,000 tons, a 30-knot ship might well have been pushing 40,000 tons by the end of the design phase. The hours needed 82,000 shaft horsepower more. That's a 50% increase from the 130,000 shaft horsepower than the South Dakotas for those 6 knots. And as well as the stretch bow, that machinery has to be armored. So if you look, you can understand where the weight comes from. And that's pretty much it. You ask for speed, your engine power, you're requiring sort of, well, let's put it this way, the speed goes up like that, but the requirements in terms of horsepower will go up like that. It's just massive and overwhelming. It seems, if the Germans sorted with an air carrier and the Italians sorted with a carrier at the same time, what could the Allies do? Shelter in place. You would, if the Italians are sorting around the Mediterranean with a carrier, the Royal Navy will make that target numero uno, and the U-class submarines, they will clear the area, and U-class submarines will be told, have a hunting day. That is the only option the Royal Navy really has, other than going and fight a carrier battle, with the Italians having a lot of on-call land-based air. They'd probably end up doing that at some point, but their first choice would be U-class submarine, you're based out of Malta, make sure that thing goes to the bottom the moment it pokes its head out of port. There would be permanently a U-class submarine sitting outside its port going, move. Try it. As for the Germans, well, that's a major task group operation. It's a major task group operation. Interesting question from the Shrike 616. At this point, I think it's safe to say that political foresight, or lack thereof, and understanding of military geopolitics was a major factor in World War II. Could a successor to the political beast that was Admiral Beatty or someone of his ilk have prevented this? In Indian navies, he gets a rightful bashing for his World War I performance, but his thinking as First Sea Lord seems sound in retrospect. I'm not quite sure where you think his thinking and sound in retrospect in First Sea Lord. He does have some improvements. In a video I'm going to be recording today, yes, I will be talking about some of his better statements and some of his sounder realizations, but I'm not really sure at any point I consider him really a great First Sea Lord. I do think it's kind of interesting, and I would say that there were officers who were better prepared for World War II and saw it coming and were doing their best to prepare the Royal Navy for it, but it's having the ability to persuade the political class to support you and the wider public to support you, and that's a whole different ball game of support and issues. Duke of Pedrington, would it have been better to send 2 refitted, modernised Renown class battlecruisers with Prince of Wales to hunt Bismarck than Hood? All 3 would have had much better fire control and radar. HMS Hood might have been one of the strongest and fastest capital ships in Royal Navy time, but it was an excuse to run it down like that. Now, interesting enough, Joshua Williams comes back with 3 times 2 times 15-inch guns. So that's 12 15-inch 42s. And Hood had 8 times 15-inch 42s and 10 14-inch 50s. and it's versus, well, it's 15-inch 45s on Bismarck. Joshua writes originally 15-inch 50s. They're 15-inch 45s. Um, mm, it's an interesting question to put up there. You see, the thing is, if you are talking about this in a simple scenario, you'd go, well, yes, that's more guns. And if they've got radar controlled firepower and they've been updated as much as Renown have been, so both Repulse and Renown are upgraded to the same level, then honestly, Renown's accuracy moving forward does give them a slight edge. That gives you 12 15-inch guns and 10 14-inch guns, of which, let's be honest, about 2 work, occasionally 6, versus 8 15-inch 42 gun 45s. The one advantage, the major advantage I can see is, yes, it's an extra 4 15-inch guns. But more, to my mind, is the fact that you therefore have 2 fast vessels. And you've basically got a free ship formation to attack Bismarck, which is going to divide its fire. There's also even less of a chance of it getting away under those scenarios. Because, yeah, if it golden bullets one of them, there's still 2 more firing away. Honestly, though, it could have been more sensibly achieved had they had kept the carrier, Hood, King George V, and Prince of Wales all together. If they'd been together as a task group, rather like the Royal Cunningham led at Matapan, then you'd have had a carrier to help launch strikes. You'd have also had 3 capital ships to engage. One of those are worked up one with 14-inch 50s, which is King George V, pretty darn good ship. Yes, you'd have still had Hood, but the odds are, if she wouldn't have been at the front of the line, it would have been King George V at the front of the line. That would have been Toby's flagship. So yeah, she would have been probably third in line. She'd have probably been put in the rear, and there's a reason for that. If you're in a scenario where you've got 3 ships, one is worked up and fine, one is in need of refit but worked up and fine, and one is having problems, you stick the one with problems in the middle. And therefore you've got the 2 base points covered. But it would have been interesting. Lots of interesting questions about the Alaska class. I hope I answered them with my point earlier. Wayne's World, you forgot to assign our homework. I don't always assign homework. I sometimes ask questions. I try to ask questions at the end because it's a nice thing to talk about. And there have been some interesting points made about what the Royal Navy could have done, what any navies, work back in time and go, how could you best prepare for the war? Honestly, Henderson's plan in 1933, and I haven't ever managed to find a document which he talks about. I've gone through the National Archives, I've gone through everything. But I've heard enough other sources talking about Henderson having a plan in 1933. Sounds like a fairly comprehensive plan to me. It was predicated on there not being another treaty agreed in 1936. If there hadn't been another treaty agreed, if they hadn't tried to go for the Second London Treaty, and things hadn't been delayed, I do wonder how much further along the British procurement would have been. I think at least 2 more carriers would have been built and in service. I I'm not sure about the King George V's, whether they would have all been in service, but I think probably Prince of Wales wouldn't have been so far behind KGV. And I think he'd have definitely wanted to do with one of the other battle cruisers. So either Hood or Repulse would have been upgraded. I also think you'd have had probably another Queen Elizabeth upgraded and probably a couple more cruisers in service. Not major changes, really. A lot of sloops more sloops. It would have been an extra 40 odd sloops in service by World War II, but that would have made a difference. The idea has changed between roughly 40 under the Royal Navy to a whole Dominion Navy thing of roughly 90 or something. And different people have different views on what it would have been. It seems to be something that was discussed about, but was difficult to get politicians behind. Unsurprisingly, they don't tend to like spending money unless they have to. And then they spend money very quickly, and then because it looks good, and then they spend the next few months recriminating over it, going, "Oh, we spent the wrong money. We spent too much money. We didn't put enough controls." There's an interesting debate about Japan and slave labor. They didn't. This is taking part of Marcus Franconi's questions. We know they didn't shy away from the labor practices and cruelties the Germans used in every as part of cruelty in some areas. They had enormous pool labor and forced labor, and everything you said about pumping in as much fortification and construction as possible. Again, why haven't they used this? And it boils down to logistics and the people not being in the right place for it, and then not being able to move them around. Frankly, thankfully for the people, because it just made it worse. Now, here's an interesting thing, Boris Real. About the World of Warships part, carriers in World of Warships are not particularly vulnerable to high explosive. High explosive alpha is worse than armor piercing to begin with. They have 5-second damage control cooldown, and as such are practically invulnerable to fires and flooding and their AA, better than anything else. Depiction of carriers World Warships is order of magnitude less realistic than the Japanese, having 8 Yamatos as carrier escorts midway, and that is before we get into their subspace plane factory, and let them create aircraft out of thin air. Now, that's kind of interesting because whenever I'm killing carriers in my Queen Elizabeth, which I tend to use for I'm sorry, I probably should go for upgrade and go further along, but I like Queen Elizabeth and Warspite. They're my favourites. I tend to switch to HE and massacre them. In fact, very quickly, in a few salvos, I will tend to take them out. Now, admittedly, I do have a habit of getting very close and just keep coming and coming until I am point blank range. But yeah, I tend to get through my enemy carriers quite quickly. Michael Hooch, Japanese, why are they not prepared? I thought the Japanese plan still revolved around the decisive battle concept. I've talked about the decisive battle concept enough videos for people to know my opinion on that. And fight and win decisive battle, which breaks the enemy morale and forces them to sue for peace. As I've been over, that's one part of their doctrine, one part of their operational planning. But honestly, there are a lot of people who are realists in the Japanese who understand exactly what they're going to be facing, and you'd expect them to have done some planning for it. The graphs and fleeting speech you did in this video was quite thought-provoking, especially when you mentioned Aquila. Panic is such a motivating factor in naval strategy. True. As I've said before about the Axis carriers, they don't have to be any good. They just have to exist to cause panic. That is it. They don't have to be good. They just have to exist. And panic will ensue. There is a difference between talking about a Graf Zeppelin, which is possibly the worst theorized carrier ever designed. The Aquila is made worse by the fact they use the German system, and the only carrier which is probably beats them for being worse is because it was actually made in the service is the Burn. And honestly, I have more sympathy for the Burn and the French converting a very slow dreadnought design to a carrier than I do the Graf Zeppelin and the Aquila. Because, especially the Aquila, by that point, they are allied with the Japanese, who are fairly good at this whole carrier thing. This is actually a quote which is on an old history, an old video I wrote, but it came up in this set when I was talking about it. Quite informative education, although it sounded a bit like it was during more of my cider than center time. No, I am currently out of Iron Brew at the moment, but a delivery is on the way, hence using Pepsi. I'm usually driven by Iron Brew. I am quite happily provided and supplied by Iron Brew. And then the response from Ninja Taylor, which I do love, was that explained it. If you drink Iron Brew in that quantity, you're a certified maniac who will be banned from going anywhere near a set of steel railings and Edinburgh. I haven't been banned from going anywhere near Edinburgh yet. Some steel railings. Ugliest aircraft carrier? No, there's no such thing as an ugly aircraft carrier. Burn maybe, but even Burn has some good angles. Let's see, Mitchell. I'm loving the series. Your comments on the side of how much panic would be a single ship. Would the Kriegsmarine getting carrier force, the Italian Regia Marina, to accelerate building commissioning of Aquila? Mussolini's pride only access power with a carrier. Oh, yeah. That would have... Seriously. If the Graf Zeppelin had come into existence, then the time measured for Aquila to come into service would have been only measurable in terms of how long does it take for Mussolini to get to the nearest radio microphone. Jeffrey Blunt. One flaw in Japanese pilot training was the absolutely absurd standards for their green pilots. They did not refresh their pilot training pilots from frontline units. They also did not see rejecting so many pilots in training reduce the pool of replacement pilots. If one is going to take on the world, a pool of spare pilots would be very handy. If a pool of pilots are expendable, one needs more of them in reserve, not just the perfect Zen masters they allowed in frontline units. There is actually a very good point to that. It's actually useful to allow through people who aren't always necessarily the absolute best of the best. And there's a reason for this. If you go through pilot training and you don't finish in the top 10, but you get into a service unit anyway, you're probably going to be slightly less cocky. And there is a very good amount of literature that suggests that during their initial service, pilots will grow in capability and skills massively. But the most likely to survive in World War II in their initial service were not always the ones who scored the highest in their training. Why? Because they were cocky and thought, well, we're already amazing, so no one up here is going to match up against us. The reality, of course, is different. Whereas if you know you're good because you made it through training, but you also are tempered a bit because you know you weren't top 10, you're probably going to be slightly more, how do I put this, cautious. Not cautious to the level you're going to get yourself killed, but cautious to the level you're going to think before you act. And that's going to have a factor. That's going to be important in your survival. Right. Adrigox, so if you're going to declare war, even though you expect to lose, why not wait until you've addressed the main weakness? That said, I would suggest the biggest benefit Japan could get would be a revamp of the whole pilot training and allocation, not only so experienced pilots pass on their experience, but also you're not leaving aircraft behind just because their carrier happens to be damaged. Now, IO2. One interesting idea I had after watching the video is this, and that was Major Allied Navies one. What if in 1937-38 the US decided the Wyomings are outdated, and with the new treaty battleships being built, not capable enough to retain? However, while their 12-inch guns are insufficient against battleships, they would be still useful against cruisers and can pose a threat to the Congress. So choice is made to recycle the guns and turrets for the use of new 32 knot. I'm presuming you meant 32, 33 knot large cruiser, which is serve as carrier escort. They'd be quick to build, useful. They'd be proto-Alaskas pretty much. As the Wyomings carry 24 guns in over 12 turrets, that would allow you to build 3 of these ships with, let's be honest, 8 guns. And they could go for a 6 or 4. They could either go for a 6 ABY. That was probably too little light on firepower for the USN, as you say. So yeah, that would have been highly interesting. That would have been highly interesting and very interestingly capable. And you might have seen a very different performance for the US in that scenario, with their carriers having that level of firepower to escort. They'd be a lot less worried about the Congos. Yeah, the Congo could probably beat that, but it wouldn't beat it. It would be a very Pyrrhic victory, and it would take a long time. Now, Joseph Askins, here's a thought I just had on my way home from work. Considering when the Iowa class was designed and how many planned, I feel like the US Navy was already possibly thinking about the Montana class, but felt it wasn't yet possible to get funding from Congress due to various factors. Additionally, while the Iowas would commission as basically as fast, heavily armed carrier escorts, they're designed when a battleship was still thought to be primary naval weapon of war. Given various factors, it is possible the US had a twofold plan in place regarding its battleship fleet in the future. Firstly, if one does not count the Illinois and Kentucky, and assumes the Montana class could always be 5 ships, attack on Pearl or not. Once you add together the existing 10 fast battleships historically completed, i.e., those that were planned pre-war, one gets a battle line of 15 relatively fast, heavily armed ships. 4 of which have a higher top speed, roughly equivalent to the gap between the Royal Navy's earlier dreadnoughts and battlecruisers. Unlike the World War I German battlecruisers, have commensurate protection against their own armament. In essence, I feel like the Iowa class was meant to be a fast element of battle line that could be deployed against the carriers as a scouting element, and then speed ahead of the rest of the battle line to catch and wound the enemy line, thus allowing the 28 knot battle line to catch up and deliver the hurt. It's an interesting idea, and I wouldn't put it past the USN because I think the USN are always slightly more realistic about what war they're likely to fight than they necessarily tell Congress. I always think they're slightly more realistic. Yes. Max Straw. Item 9 bombardment after action report would have been validated against, again, in 1988 by the relative ineffectiveness of 5-inch gunfire against Iranian oil platforms during Operation Prairie Mantis. Yeah. There are issues. Good Lord, big guy. Christopher. Finns were the only good guys on the Eastern Front after the fall of Poland. The USSR was a co-belligerent Nazi journey until Operation Barbarossa preempted the Soviet invasion of the West. I know we should have propped up USSR with Lend-Lease assessment. We aided a regime responsible for murdering an order of magnitude more people than Hitler. True. But there is the old adage, my enemy's enemy is my friend. And the thing is, the Soviet Union hadn't attacked us. They'd been fighting in China against the Japanese. They invaded Poland a lot after the Germans went in there. They stabbed the Poles in the backs. But the point is, they were fighting Hitler. And as far as we were concerned at the time, he was the big bad. And then they were fighting the Japanese. Again, as far as we're concerned, at the time, the big bad. There is an interesting point, though, as to whether or not our support would actually have helped, actually made much of a difference to the Soviet Union, because even if the Germans had been able to carry on their invasion without the help of the Allies going to the rest of the Soviet Union, the odds are it would have ground to a halt at somewhere at the Urals, And yes, it would have been a big thing for Hitler and the Soviet Union to come back, but as long as we were still fighting Nazi Germany wouldn't have been able to hold on to that area. So either way, we'd have found ourselves fighting on the same side as the Soviet Union. Just whether we were allies or not and supporting them or not meant whether we had any influence over them or not. So you give them the supplies. It's real politics. It's not nice. Hmm. The Dutch should have also tried to purchase M3 tanks from the US. Does that fit the video? Yes, the Dutch should have brought everything they could afford from everyone they sell. But what would the Dutch Navy do with tanks? Well, it is part of the national effort, I suppose, but not something I'm going to be discussing. But the Dutch having tanks in Indonesia would have been interesting. It would have had an impact. Phil Vanderlyn. Well, with some minor navies such as Poland, isn't kind of the Royal Navy going here? A couple of destroyers, go to Boston, New York, Halifax, and come right back. To an extent. To an extent. It's always to an extent. Guy, didn't the British government force free Poles back to the communist Poland after the war, often to an unpleasant reception? Not really. Adam Bylan answers this with not entirely. The enforcement that was lackluster, and most Poles simply chose to emigrate. I had a neighbour who only died a couple of years ago who was, well, both him and his wife were Polish. And they'd come over during World War II and fought in World War II and then settled here. It was very, very lackluster. The British were certainly not that keen on it. But they had to do it because they didn't want to carry on fighting. It was the same disease you have as after World War One. The government might see the point in carrying on fighting and finishing the problem now, but the people don't, and there's no will to do so, therefore. John Fisher, the trouble with the Dutch screaming in January 1941 is everyone is either busy elsewhere or isn't interested in helping them. Japan is not yet a threat to them. Britain and Australia are both pushed to the limit and involved in actual live war elsewhere. America is still isolationist, except for a few only giving a damn for themselves and anyone else can go themselves. They'd be happy to sell the Dutch, but setting up a joint command, I think, would be anathema to them, especially if Britain is involved, in which case Maniac King would be frothing the mouth with his irrational British rants. Maniac King is not really as powerful in January 1941 as he is later in the year. An interesting alternative is if the Dutch had approached the country regarding needing an external source of those resources, i.e., Japan, and brokered a deal with them. Of course, the Japanese honouring that deal once they attacked the US would be surprising, but maybe they might. Doubtful. U.S. neutrality. There's an interesting question that came up on the later on about couldn't the Dutch of the U.S. build ships for them, or was the U.S. not up to it at the time in January 1939? And the thing is, in January 1939, the neutrality position is still a factor. That isn't a reality. It's less of a factor as time goes on, but it's still a factor. And the major Allied navies of World War II, January 1942, the British have lost two battlecruisers, practically decimating the fast-wigging Royal Navy, obviously accelerating the frigating Implacable class. Yes, they do. Basically, the Royal Navy goes, ooch, we're in trouble now. We're really in trouble. There's an interesting question going on. Sort of, not only has the British lost four battleships, but they have lost three of their five fast ships and can keep up with the German battleships. Crater. Then but British lost 3 battleships and 2 battlecruisers. Andrew Cox. The video is back. Royal Oak was lost in 1949. This video is looking at the situation early 1942, when the Iron had just lost 4 battleships, battlecruisers in the previous year, and 3 of those were fast ships. Mm-hmm. Basically, the loss of Royal Oak back at the beginning is the loss of Royal Oak back at the beginning. So Thompson, yes, 42 was, in my humble opinion, the darkest year for the Iron during the war. Definitely the year that tests their resolve the most. The Americans are finally out of bed and making breakfast with great enthusiasm, put on it. I think the RCN could have benefited from cruiser. Yes, 2 aren't nearly enough. The colony class were too cruise strenuous. Would the RCN have been better off pursuing Bellona or Swifter in their program of 6 per coast, equaling 12? I'd have said, actually, if I was going for it, if the Canadians had pursued our refuser class, they might well have been able to build them in Canada. Same with Australia, could have probably built our refuser class, and that could have been a starting on their industry. The reason I say our fusers rather than Didos is because the 5.25-inch is absolute nightmare of machinery to build and prepare and get organized. Whereas the twin 6-inch turret, or even a treble 6-inch turret, i.e., going for Argentina style Arafuser with 3 triple turrets, would actually be quite viable and a lot easier to build technologically. Surprising enough. Could have armed them up with 3 triple 6-inch guns and 3 twin 4.5s for AA, or more AA, 5 twin 4-inch AAs. Could have produced a fairly interesting little light cruiser. Evan, I'd rather see you go backwards in time. You have more room to change things. That was, to an extent, the Equitable Treaty series does that. There is a lot of interesting, and if people have another period they'd like me to go through, I'm happy to try and do that. But there is a sort of the viability factor of, can we actually change things? What can we do? How much information is available? What the potentials were? The whole of this I tried to use and made a conscious effort to try and use what were the arguments at the time, what were the other plans available at the time, and why would I go with those plans over the other ones. And trying to provide evidence from acts like when I'm justifying the carrier program and why the carrier should have been kept in construction in 1939 rather than stalled on Churchill's orders. You will notice I concentrated on the anti-submarine warfare capabilities of carriers because that's actually the case the Admiralty made and various other powers, parts of the government and the British government make the carriers for the convoy protection, anti-submarine warfare, surface radar protection. That's what they're making the case. Not the strike cab potential, not the air defense, the anti-submarine warfare. If they'd be making the air defense case of the carriers, then Churchill being Churchill, I'm not sure the RAF would have managed to stomp the Royal Navy's fighter program quite as hard as they did. Then there's the debate between D8 and myself over by the end of World War II, the Canadian had the 3rd largest navy in the world. And that's because of a lot of creative trickery in the numbers. And I know where you're coming from, but as I point, USSR was officially 3rd. I know it's debatable, but technically they were 3rd in tonnage, followed very closely by Canada. D8 then goes, but on tonnage, not numbers, and numbers is how most navies count size. Today, most navies count size by numbers of ships. In the 1920s and 30s, the legacy of the treaties meant that the 40s and 50s, navies were counted on tonnage as much, if not more, than numbers. So, yeah. Sorry, that's what they counted at that time. Now, there's a B86. I'm actually hyped for the Christmas special Soviet focus videos. They are going to be fun. I've got a whole load of books arriving, and I'm hoping it's like I've saved all the hider footage, etc., for when I get the tower running up and running. And it's one of the things which is, do you know the interesting thing about a tower unit? It's going to cost me to get the decent graphics card so I can do the work I need to do without having the issues which I think this thing runs into. This poor laptop. it's probably going to cost me as much as the RAM, motherboard, and CPU and cooler for the CPU combined to buy the graphics card. And I'm reusing my old power supply unit. Well, that's the plan. It saves money if I do that. But yeah, it's expensive. These at the moment, they are really expensive. We'll work it through. The H89. Listening to the political situation these minor powers were in makes me wonder what modern smaller powers within contested waters with Russia and Black Sea and should do, and how they should plan naval forces. That's a whole interesting debate which we've had on Beltramps and might be doing again on Beltramps soon. What do we think the small powers in the Black Sea, etc., should be doing? That's an interesting name. In 6 years' time, people will be talking about what the Allies should have done in 2015 all the way up to 2025. To mind the Royal Navy, Royal Australian Navy, and Royal Canadian Navy have to unite into a single command now, increasing national strategic industries like shipbuilding and especially united procurement. Otherwise, I foresee them being entirely swallowed up by the USN and lose their autonomy. It'd be interesting to see how the USN would do that, because even during World War II, the Polish, etc., and the Free Navies never lost their autonomy. You'd have to invade and take over the countries for that to happen. But yeah, there are issues. There are issues. They do need to spend more. Quizmaster China, why wasn't the USA outbuilding Japan in 1940-41? I think I know which one you're referring to in terms of stats. As Don Giovanni points out, Congress and public were isolationist and believed war would not reach them, and it's basically politics, politics, politics. There's also the reality that they're spending a lot of that time in 40-41 actually building the shipyards, which will then boost up the Navy for the rest of the time. So they're first building the logistics and infrastructure, which I'm not going to critique them for, because you need to build infrastructure. The thing is, they could have built it earlier. They could have built it earlier. There's an interesting debate on the major Axis navies in January 1942, where Marcus Franconian and Thoroughly Confused are discussing mass production difficulties of it. And there's this point from Thoroughly Confused. You're spot on regarding lack of fuel manpower. Regarding industrial capacity, Germany constantly gets overrated. If you watch some of Dr. Clarke's videos regarding naval build-up previous to World War II, you'll find that Germany had very little in terms of modern surface ships. I can understand why their idiot in power became fed up with lack of surface fleet success, but given the situation, sinking the Hood can count as an outstanding success, even though Bismarck promptly got sunk soon after. Regarding surface-to-air missiles, to my knowledge, it was the Japanese who made most progress in the area, but not enough to make an impact. In one survivor interview, a Japanese sailor claimed that they had anti-air missiles on board, select high-status ships, but none had been trained on how to use those. At World War II, Times didn't have the guidance systems required to make a missile actually hit a moving aircraft consistently. The Germans were happy enough whenever their missiles would hit the UK. Now, that's an interesting thing. I've heard that too about the Japanese. I've never seen actually any evidence or any proof. But when I was first discussed about it, I figured it would probably, if anything, be a radio beam rider, i.e., they'd shoot a radio beam at the target and the missile would hone in on follow up the radio, or radio directed in some ways, like the Queen Bee system the Royal Navy used for target training. That seemed to be the most logical, technological wise. I can't say, but I've had it brought up to me a couple of times. And I think it's possible. I think also that there's a lot of technology which doesn't actually get into service in World War II because it's very finicky. It's going to sound strange, but the cutting edge of tech is often very fragile. Very, very fragile. It takes a while to take technology from the experimental stage to the practical, usable stage. And there is a phase in between where you call it the initial operating scenario. And during that stage, basically you go, on it in the wrong way and it will not work. 14-inch guns in a quad turret being a good example of this issue. There are lots of problems around because of technology which will theoretically work on paper, being developed, looking good, and in reality, it's still very sensitive. Chris Master Chan, I can't win as Donetsk because of Bletchley. Really, if I can switch my ciphers, I might get my boat. I might not get my boat sunk. It's not the ciphers which are the problem. This is one of the things often misunderstood about Bletchley, and it's a point I'm often trying to make. We obsess about code breaking, and yes, that is critical. But it's signals and traffic analysis which are the big killers for the Germans. Signals and traffic analysis. It's their constant need to talk to each other and tell each other where they are. That means there are all these transmissions going around which you then read. So before you can actually read what they say, you have the fact that there's a transmission which came from over there, or from this position, over there, according to this position. Okay, we got a boat somewhere in that. It was there. And it transmitted over here yesterday. Oh, and it transmits over here. Oh, we now know it's rough operating area. And it's signals analysis. It is signals analysis, which is the big killer. Yes, if you can read what the enemy's saying to each other, that's great. But the fact you can tell if they're talking to each other and that they are talking to each other from where they're talking to each other is often enough information. Remember, you don't... How do I put this? If you walk into a restaurant, you don't need to read the menu to know if it's a fancy restaurant or a family eatery or a dive. You don't. You don't need to read the menu. They can be perfectly clean, respectable, but the moment you get in, you've got the atmosphere. You can see everyone else around you. You don't need to look at that menu to know. It's the same with codes. You've got the information going off. You've got all the information from the actual signals before you even get into reading the actual what they said. Duke of Petchington, and this is from Major Allen Navies of World War II, January 1942. Crete being poorly invested by both Greece and the UK was not only the biggest lack of foresight from Greece and the UK in the 1940s, but a painful loss of both. Yes. Now, however, I have a question for you, and this goes back to 1959. Allied problems videos. Could the UK have invested better in multi and air defences and strike capabilities such as early warning radar stations, more fighter squadrons, wings, A's, and A weapons, and other airfield on the small island of the archipelago, and better infrastructure to support such air defence and strike aircraft long term? It's a wonderful location, but it's logistically supporting it. Anything you put there, you've got to support, which means more convoys, more ships coming in, more stuff you need to more stuff going through supplies, more stockpile. If you start long enough back and you start to turn it into, I don't know, if you do what I call a global fortress program, let's say in January 1930, Britain looks around the world and goes, right then, Falkland Islands, Gibraltar, Malta, Singapore, probably Ceylon, Sri Lanka as we call it today, maybe certain islands in the North Sea, Scapa Flow. These are our global naval bastions. We need to fortify and strengthen these to the point at which they will be strong. And from January 1930, had gone, all right, they're going to be stockpiling naval supplies anyway, so let's put in 5.25-inch turrets for their air defense. Let's put in radars, sort of develop and put in radars. Let's build bunkered bunkered airfields where all the personnel, all the pilots, fitters, etc., can sleep in bunkers and be protected, and all the aircraft can be put down into safety of shelters, etc., so they can all be nicely protected, and including bomber-sized aircraft. It would have been good. But I think also there's the trouble that the aircraft size in 1930 means that you're bomber-sized aircraft in 1932 in 1930s is probably going to be your thing that can fit bomber-sized aircraft. Is probably going to fit your mosquitoes in World War II. Still, that might work. Heavy bombers are a big thing to support, whereas a mosquito sort of bomber force, etc., there could have been sensible and could have been useful. Alexei Henlik. I'm surprised for the IJ a crash course of frigates and sloop wasn't mentioned. And my response to that was the trouble is not only when do you build, where do you build it, but how do you expect engine construction and industrial capacity at this point to support it? That's why it's part of 1939, 1940 videos. And it makes, Alexei does respond, it makes 100% sense. Basically, at any point, the earlier the Japanese can build some frigate slash sloop slash whatever as escort, the better chance they have. Anything that reduces their losses, anything, and increases US Navy submarine losses is going to have an impact in their war out there. It's going to buy them time. Not necessarily, not win the war for them, but buy them time. Nicole Ross. Hello. The Axis could not have won. However, the Germans could have made it much more difficult by having good signal security. True. They could have made it far more difficult by just, I don't know, not talking to each other so much. Maybe sending different codes for their weather transmissions. And I would, as you put out there as well, and also suggest using, I don't know, cable communications for their land forces in Europe whenever they're in garrison, rather than sending radio communications still. Although, there again, thanks to SOE, the British have probably still been hearing all about it. Operational info, just necessary information in encrypted landline signals. Code your data before encryption. Only report when you find a target. No repeated info in messages such as Hail Hitler. I know, YouTube won't like that. No daily signals such as I'm here for the Allies to sink me. Yeah, applies to Japanese, applies to lots of people. Always assume your enemy is listening to you. Why, foreign communities, why did spelling go from Kriegsmarine to Kriegsmarine, as in Kriegs, to Kreigs? It's dyslexia in Microsoft Office. It's the joy of life. Adam Byrne, I noticed that you haven't talked about Titan's name at all. Did they not have enough to talk about? Not really in World War II, but that was also the reason I put some minor navies. Marcus Franconian, the Dutch could have shot Admiral Hart and could have ignored General Wavell, as the first admitted he was too old, diverting ships to Australia and pulling submarines out of defensive lines, ignoring a strategy in place that had been worked on for the past 8 years, scolding Dorman for not going to Saraja but to Tilajep in the west, as it was part of having a safe base during the wartime. Wavell wasting Dutch aircraft and bombers on minor runs, depleting the only effective submarine force in the area to protect Singapore, having submarines out of position, including close to 100 American submarines being sent to the places no Japanese ship would ever enter. Yeah, there are all sorts of issues. This is one reason, so again, loss of Phillips. I'm not always agreeing with him. Tom Phillips is not my favourite admiral, but he is better than what else turns up out there, and it's a while to replace him. And let's be honest, when Somerville comes out, Somerville is already overworked and stressed. He's still a major improvement on what's out there, but he's on a far tighter leash because of what the scenario he's coming into. The one change certainly produced some very interesting ideas. So, going through all these different changes, I've come up with the idea of what would be my question for this video and for the end of this video, and I'm trying to stop it going on far longer than 70 minutes. So, here is the question. You can go back to any year in the 1920s and 30s. You can stay there for a week. You can go to any nation. And your limitation is you're there to make World War II, from a naval sense, go better for whichever nation you're going to. Which year do you go to? Who do you go to speak to? And what information do you take back with you? You're allowed to take 2 books back with you. Only 2 books. Please, no one say my book. My book's great. My book's lovely. I'm a very big fan of my book. It's absolutely gorgeous. I do admit this. But honestly, it's not the book I would take back with me. There's lots of little bits of information in there, which it could be useful, but yeah, you need something more. Probably one of Freeman's books I'd probably be instinct head towards, at least. But no, I would love to see who you would go back to speak, which year you pick, who you would go back to speak to for a week, what 2 books you take back with you, and what you'd be focusing on changing. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the videos, and thank you for all your support. You make all this possible. Thank you. Take care, and have fun.